Hi. I am so excited to be here. I was just thinking how, it's going back in my memory, in boot camp they would yell at us all the time. You guys have it so easy. This is nothing like it used to be. The military is a cakewalk now. And so I just look around this room, and you guys are the ones that paved the way. There's so many people in here who just made it easy for us in this day. And so I just feel so much gratitude to be here, and to all of you to many of you for your service. My name is Jenn Calaway.
Same thing does, Jen.
Did they? That was a trick they used every time then, huh? Well, it worked on me, so. Let's see, my name's Jenn Calaway, and there's lots of bio information in front of you, but I'll just run through it. I joined the Marine Corps out of Puerto Rico in 2006. And growing up, I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I had no idea anything about the military. We put flags in our front yard a couple times a year, and there were bumper stickers, and that's about it. So I was really didn't know what to expect. I was 24, turned 24 in boot camp, and really couldn't get used to the idea of a really young, she's about 5 years younger and 2 feet shorter than me, my drill instructor, yelling at me. I was like, wait, oh, this, I learned very quickly that it was very serious. So I went to, finish boot camp in Paris Island. There was 12 weeks there, and then a month-long additional combat training, which is mandatory in the Marine Corps, and I don't even know where that was. And then up to Fort Meade, Maryland. I spent a year there in school doing first public affairs specialist training, then combat correspondent, which means a basic print broadcast journalist, and then got the additional designator of broadcast journalist, so got video and voice training. So after Fort Meade, Maryland, I headed to Japan. I was in Tokyo for 1 year, and that was pretty amazing. I was in an Air Force det as a Marine, so it was like a palace. They took away your trays at the chow hall, and it was just the neatest thing for us. I spent a year there and traveled all over Asia. Yes, sir.
Can we back up to why did you join the Marines?
Oh, that's a great question. And please, let's do questions the whole time, so feel free to interrupt at any time. I was from Salt Lake City, and it was very conservative there, and I couldn't do the culture. I felt like I just wanted travel and excitement, and so I moved to Puerto Rico, kind of out of the blue, and there was pretty focused on partying. I didn't have much of a focus and was really enjoying what I thought was the good life down there, but I didn't have any purpose, and I was far away from my family. And I remember watching a TV show. I was watching The West Wing. I don't know if you're familiar with that TV show, and I fell in love with CJ, this White House secretary. I was like, oh, I want so much to have some meaning or some purpose in my life. And I didn't know what I was doing, but I ended up at the recruiter's office. So it was, in retrospect, I was just craving to give back after kind of being selfish for so long. So thank you for that question.
Is there any reason why it was the Marines?
Not really, actually. I went to the Air Force first, and they were very busy. They didn't kind of have time to talk to me, and that was just in this particular recruiting station. And they said, well, why don't you check out the Marine Corps across the hall? And I said, what's the Marine Corps? And then it turns out there was a recruiter there, and there was something about him. He had this solidarity to him. And I just began to trust him. I worked with him for a period of a month and a half or 2 months, and just went back and saw him and said, I don't know if this is for me. And when he told me about this public affairs position, and it sounded very unique and very interesting, and I said yes without talking to my parents or anything. So that was an interesting phone call.
I'll bet.
Yeah.
If my daughter called and told me she joined the Marine Corps, I think I'd know hard at that.
Yeah. And it turns out I had an uncle who was a Vietnam veteran and also a Marine, but hardly anyone in our family knew it because he just didn't tell anyone. Because he had a lot of really horrible treatment coming back, and so not even our family knew until I had joined the Marine Corps, and he started saying, yeah, I was a Marine too. So that was really neat to connect with him on that. So now I'm in Japan, and we traveled we had a really nice ability to travel all over Asia and cover stories. So I would attach to all services. So if an Army unit was going to work with a Thai unit to train together, or if there was a natural disaster, I was in Bangladesh, I would go and cover these medical exercises, all kinds of neat stuff. So even it was neat to see the Washington, D.C. area of the country as a girl from small town Utah, and then to go to Japan and travel all of Asia. I was in heaven as far as travel and excitement. It was scary and exciting and exactly what I was looking for. So I'm going to pause here and show you an example of the stories that I would do as a broadcast journalist. So this is kind of typical. This is actually in Afghanistan. So after Japan, I came back to California and then did a tour in Afghanistan. This is a pretty good example of my type of work. Let's see if we have sound. So we've got some sound.
Yeah, that's weird. Also hit the screen.
You have to plug that in. Is that into your phone or your microphone?
City of Marcia. A crucial element of being a warfighter is helping to repair the damage of war can cause a community.
Following any kinetic operations or armed operations where the Marines are using the firepower and munitions, we have to pay for the damage. We don't have to, but we'd like to pay for the damage that we cause to the local civilians. It creates a better atmosphere and working environment for us as we go into hold operations.
Young Afghan men say they just want to work, to provide for their families.
30,000 came home to get started.
But prior to the start of Operation Mushtarak in Marcia, the citizens could only work for the Taliban. And unfortunately, the families of Marcia paid the price for the Taliban's presence.
30,000 battle damage and 400 friends.
Civil Affairs Marines seek to remedy that problem.
It's hugely rewarding. Sometimes, you see the suffering that's caused in these situations and the people.
And so what's happening here is, as public affairs, we serve as the liaison between military presence and civilian populations, the media, anyone outside of the military who doesn't necessarily understand our operations. And so we would go through a town, the Taliban or something, it would get destroyed, and civil affairs Marines would go through and reimburse people and try to get them building their town back. And it was a really neat process. So I was essentially a propagandist in that, I'm trying to kind of counteract all the negative press that would happen in the war, but it didn't feel that way at all to me because there was so much good happening that didn't get any press. So all that we would see on CNN and Fox News is how American military is destroying towns, people are children, all this horrible news that's getting views. But what's really happening on the ground is we're attempting to go back and make up for our wrongs and get people building or farming legitimate crops rather than the poppy that the Taliban wanted them to for heroin. So I got an extraordinary perspective on the military in that I got to see all this really neat stuff that was happening on the ground, all the individual relationships that were being built.
So where was this shown in once you did these videos? How did it get shown in mass media?
Sure, great question. So our immediate audience was internal, so it would be in the Marine Corps Times, publications that we see here, base news stations, TV stations, and then also our footage would go out and be broadcast to a hub where CNN, Fox News, BBC, anyone could pick it up, which was good and bad because our footage was getting out there. So what's really happening is getting out there, but the news media can show that however they want. So sometimes it would get spun out of context and what wasn't happening. But a lot of our footage would go back to CNN, Fox News, and it's that background footage that you would see 24 hours a day talking about. They would just take the B-roll, so the raw footage, and then they would do what they wanted with it. And then these packaged products, that was often for our internal media. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with AFN when you're stationed overseas. So that's where we'd see a lot of this stuff. So now I want to just flip through some photos. There's a lot here. So let's fire off questions at will. These are EOD Marines, which it was so hard to watch them just sit there and, man, my nerves just waiting for something to happen. And then there's a lot of photos of these really great interactions between community members. I mean, really, honestly, what I saw was us just going in there and teaching. I mean, these people were so happy to see us and so excited to have us in their homes. And the kids were so fun to play with. So it's a lot of this hearts and minds type stuff that you hear about. But to me, it felt very real and very genuine. So I have a question for previous war veterans. Did you ever have a combat camera attached to your unit? Or in the movie Full Metal Jacket, there's Joker. Did anyone ever have any interaction with folks like that?
Nope.
Were you ever aware of them being kind of around? Go ahead.
In Vietnam,
Mhm.
we had a speaker that was in a somewhat similar civil affairs group, and we didn't know until he spoke to us that the Marine Corps did have such a group in Vietnam that was literally a group that went into all the villages and worked in the villages with the village people, and some of the groups that were not the soldiers, but people that were in the villages that fought against the Viet Cong, and small squads of Marines that did that civil affairs stuff and then kind of fought back against the bad guys. And it was a group that was a CAP group, CAP. It was a new thing back then in Vietnam. And he told a great story about what he did and how the group did it. So very similar to this activity.
Excellent.
Yeah, that was started back in Vietnam.
And what are some of the other experiences?
I was at headquarters USAFE in Ramstein, Germany, and we had a combat camera unit, and they were really good. And they took pictures, and then they'd put them up in the headquarters building. That's how I found out about them, actually. And I like to go down there and just talk to those guys about their experiences. Because that's what I actually wanted to do when I joined the Air Force, but I got a different specialty.
Yeah, it was a neat job in that I would get to go and kind of do everyone else's job or see the coolest parts of the other jobs for a day and then head back and tell other people about it. So it was really interesting. And then was there a hand over here that had some experience? Okay.
Jen, did you ever work with the women those are the ones that I was exposed to earlier in Fallujah. Those groups were going out and working with the women, which, they couldn't interact with the men at all.
Yes.
And they weren't on patrol. So they had to make special
Yes.
trips.
So I'm going to back up a tiny bit and then answer that question. I just want to talk about deployment as a female. And so many people deploy as a large unit, but we were what was called an individual augmentee, in that we would attach to these large units and tell their stories. And so as a female with this special kind of ability to broadcast, like they wanted footage. Higher-ups from back in the States and higher-ups in country wanted this footage. They wanted the stories to be told. And they needed people with this broadcast journalist designator. And so they say, yeah, bring them in, get them in these hot zones, get them in these unique places, stuff's happening, we want this footage. And then I would show up as a female and they'd be like, oh shit, a female? Like, we don't have a restroom for you, we don't have where are we gonna put you, what are we gonna do with you? And so they would often get very upset, and then I would just have to say, I'm sorry, I'm here and you have to talk to me. and so they would warm up to the idea eventually, and they did want their stories to be told. So, but on a lot of patrols, I would have to disguise my hair, and because the Afghan men, if they saw that a woman was with the American military, they wouldn't respect them and wouldn't talk to them. And so that was an interesting experience. And then once people warmed up to the idea, instead I would wear a headscarf, and designate off the bat that I was a female, so I wasn't trying to like hide anything, or we would approach it in different ways. Please.
So during that point, though, I mean, there must have been a few times where, because of your job, that you had to interact with the males. So how did that play out? What kind of changes, if any, did you have to make to get in there and do what you're doing?
Such a good question, and that's maybe was the hardest thing to demilitarize from is I became one of the guys essentially, and could like hang and cuss and talk a big game with the rest of them, and so I quickly had to earn their trust. And then what if that meant, like, you know, one time I had to kind of prove myself. We had bought a goat from the local Afghans. They're like, oh, a woman's here, we need to kill the goat. And so I ended up like sawing the head off this goat, and it was awful. It was kind of cool, and it was really, but I remember like being very caught up in the machismo energy, like trying to prove myself, and it worked. I got interviews, I got whatever I needed at that point. So yeah, I really became one of the guys. And then about halfway through my deployment is when they implemented the female engagement team, which was really neat. They saw that the Afghans were starting to trust us and let us into their homes, but if there was a female in the home and American military wanted to come in, it was creating all sorts of problems. And so the female engagement team, it was females from all sorts of MOSs, the medical specialists, admin, I mean, all kinds of females. And then an interpreter would go out into the community. There's a great picture of the female engagement team. And they would, the locals would let us into their compounds and their homes, which was so unheard of. And no men were allowed, so we had to have female officers to lead the operation and have a lot of like really firm guidance and plans around it. And we got to engage with their children and things that the men were never able to do. And so it was a really neat thing to be a part of, to approach the war essentially from this really kindred gateway, which, because a lot of, other than that, the female military in Afghanistan were essentially admin roles and back on the big, large bases. So it was a great experience for them.
Explain the headscarf and the significance of female interaction with the families and why the headscarf is so important.
That was our way of coming to them on their terms. So if they saw us, this is our interpreter here without a headscarf, so she can kind of be more brazen, but if they saw us without our headscarves, it was considered risque. And so we would like cover up as much as possible, and that would warm them up to the idea of an American woman, because all they hear is that there were like heathen women and no.
Showing respect.
Yes, certainly. And they were beautiful scarves. I still have them. So it was also a great opportunity for people who never got to get off base, these women, to play a really integral role in their deployments. And these kids, man, it was just the neatest experience to see the actual interactions.
What were some of your perceptions of concerns of the women in the households you would visit? I mean, what would they talk to you about?
Well, they were very hesitant to, they would never talk about Taliban or anything that could get them killed. We really just focused on the basic, their basic hygiene needs. So we would teach them like cleanliness, and we had some field ways to approach that, field-friendly ways that they could use out in the middle of nowhere. And a lot of just relationship building, and because the women, they would never talk about their husbands or dynamics. So I was a part of this in the very beginning stages of it, so it was just warming up to each other and not a whole lot of in-depth stuff happening just yet. I would like to think that that evolved as it went on. Looks like we're having a natural pause here. What other questions do we have? It was kind of, go ahead.
So, Jenn, no was here last year.
Mm-hmm.
She was a combat medic in Afghanistan. So there was that interaction as well for females being medics on the ground. And she was telling us pretty much the same thing, that she was part of one of those female engagement teams, and she did a lot of that besides her role as a medic to a unit on the ground. So she did a lot of that.
Excellent.
Jen, what weapons did you carry?
I had an M9 hip pistol and then a M16A4.
You carried those all the time?
Yes, and as a combat correspondent or a videographer, we're a rifleman first, and only once the situation is secure, then we are a cameraman.
Were the Iraqi women or the Afghani women,
Okay.
what did they think about that, you having weapons? Did they ever?
I think that's where our headscarves were kind of helpful.
Yeah.
To show us that we were actual women, because they would look at us like we're big monsters, and like, why do you need what? And so.
Did they feel though? I mean, you wonder when they look at you and they live in such a different culture and they have no power at all, no control, no individuality, looking at you who have all of that. Was any of that, could you see any of that?
Yes, and we would be briefed on that, because the hope is that they're going to pick up some independence or some inspiration from that. But if we could not impress that at all. So we could not encourage them to change their lives or take a stand, or not in the slightest. So.
Was carrying weapons by the journalists a Marine thing, or was that universal with Army?
I'm pretty sure in a combat zone, if you're a military journalist, you are a rifleman first. And
I know that's the Marines, because you're a rifleman.
First, no matter what.
Even a pilot is a rifleman first.
Yeah.
I would imagine, yes. I think so. And then the civilian media are the ones who don't.
You're not allowed at all to carry weapons.
Yeah, I want to say there was a no, yeah, I don't think so.
No.
And there was dynamics where the civilian journalists, I don't know if you guys have heard, would highly endanger the troops that they went out with, because they're trying to get the shot, no matter what that means, standing up in the middle of a combat zone, and so now they're under fire because of this cameraman, and so that's something that we got pounded into us. There was one military journalist, and he was in a combat zone and snapped a photo with his flash on in a dark raid, and so they took him back to the last thing they were at, and they taped him to the inside of a cupboard and they left him there. And so we learned very quickly, like, do not endanger the troops that you are with. And it was hard. It was a balance to play with, because I would see a great shot, like perfect, but I could not, like, no way, can't get it, because I would mess up the patrol formation, and then if I had to use a restroom as a female, they had to do full perimeter security, and I would just have to stand there very awkwardly with this group of guys around, and so that created a problem, and then I just never went to the bathroom, and and so that didn't work out so well. So let's see.
Why were you in Afghanistan?
For a 7-month tour. And that was, I thought it was really, that was as much as I think it should be with people who are out of the wire. And then in the Marine Corps, their tours are only 6 months. Unless you're at a larger base in those more administrative roles, then you're a year-long deployment. And I think that's so smart, because in the early days of the Iraq War, they had people over in hot combat zones for a year, and it was not good at all.
And what kind of equipment did you carry as far as the photo?
The photo?
Yeah.
So I had a shoulder-mounted video camera, and on that it had a microphone. Then I had the other piece of the microphone, this piece, in my pocket. So I was always ready to, like, interview someone in a split moment. Also had a big camera. Let's see, actually, I think it's on this photo. On the, I think only the video camera's here, but on my hip I would have a still camera, and that would often have a very long zoom lens. And what this was awesome for is because that gear setup essentially right there, I had a backpack with a satellite in it, so I could go anywhere in the combat zone, and I would do a story, do the video interviews, snap the photos, and then do a broadcast story that you saw, these edited packaged pieces, and then a print story, and then a radio story from the audio, and then a standalone photo, and it's like a full journalist setup right there. And then I would just shoot it back to our hub with my satellite in my backpack. So it's really neat. Yeah. And that setup right there, the general would say, I mean, he started to gain trust in Corporal Calaway to be able to find stories and put them out. And so he would give me kind of free rein to go anywhere. Like, if I heard there was a story down in I was never allowed in too hot of combat zones. There was a point when the guys just said no, like, sorry, no female is coming with us on this raid. So it was neat to be able to have the trust to go and pursue these stories. There was one time when a town had been just demolished, just taken from top down, bottom. And we worked with them to rebuild the town. I found out this was happening, caught a bird out there, told the story of this town and the rebuilding efforts and the relationships that were happening, and it got 14,000 American dollars because of the video. So it was really neat. I mean, joining the military, I never had any, if I was after purpose, in my tour in Afghanistan, it felt so relevant and so exciting, and I'd never had that feeling of playing a part of something bigger than myself, and it was really phenomenal. Coming back from that was just like, oh, I want to go back. That was so important, and I felt so alive all of the time.
So why did you do that?
I think that's a good question. I think that my enlistment was up, and also I didn't process all of this. It was a lot of exciting stuff, from the tour in Asia to Afghanistan. The only way that I processed my emotions was to drink, and I drank with the best of them. And so I never really allowed myself to process things, and so it just built up, and I wanted away from it and out. And I wanted my time back, when I got out of the military, I was like, got rid of everything, and I never wanted to see another military person again. And then, so I processed those things, got my head clear, and then I realized what a special experience this was, and how much I learned from it. So I would say I wish that I would have learned to process those a little better, because it was, yeah. Does anyone else have any kind of experience with that? Or did you have a question?
Just generally, Armed Forces Network, how active is that today?
It's huge. So it's a huge production in Tokyo, Japan, and then in Germany there's another hub. And it's a full-scale broadcast production studio. I did some anchor time while I was there. And they make it their mission to really inform troops and really give them the messages that we don't get when we're overseas. I don't know if you remember any of those silly informational spots. Really fun and stupid and silly stuff to make people feel at home, and they take it a very serious job. So it's still very much in play, and their technology is really getting on par with civilian media. So
That's good, because I spent some time Armed Forces Radio, TV.
Awesome.
57 to 59. And we refer to the equipment as the 5%ers. The congressmen were getting 5% to give us the crappiest equipment in the world.
Yeah, it's often hand-me-downs. Especially in the Marine Corps, we would get the hand-me-downs after the Air Force and the Army. Everyone had used it. So, yeah, it can be antiquated, but I also remember I learned so much in my trade from trying to get my old, outdated laptops to work in Afghanistan, and with this, just for hours going at these connections and stuff like this. I learned so much. I talk about adapt and overcome with technology.
So what are you studying at CU?
CU, I went up there on the GI Bill and first tried film. I thought that would be a good fit. I tried creative writing, international affairs, and now I've landed with public relations. So I feel like that's a great fit. I also do video, so I feel really grateful that the military gave me this great trade to work with. I've made money and supported myself from doing freelance video. So that's a really neat side effect. And another thing is, so I started my own freelance business to do that video, and I would go out into town and start doing business with civilians, and they would be like late and not show up with equipment or stuff. I was like, what is happening? You know? And that's when I really realized how valuable this military experience is. Those tiny things, those tiny disciplinary actions, like be on time and show up looking your best and cut off your IPs and just show up as your best. It's such valuable information that really has not, that I felt was just missing. And so now I like to talk whenever I can. I did an Ignite Boulder talk in front of all of Boulder's like very liberal community and talked about my experience in the military. And I just want them to know, because I joined, I come from a community that was also, I didn't know anything about the military. And then to speak about the military to a similar community was awesome. Like, those guys need to know how neat this stuff is. Please.
So just back up a second on your on the processing portion. Did during that particular point, was the anything like support groups, but not sponsored by the military, but support groups available to you, and how receptive were those groups if there were any?
Awesome. After I landed here in Boulder just by chance, following a boyfriend out here, and then the relationship fell apart, and I remember just drinking, and not able to even kind of like leave my house sometimes. And I looked up online and found Veterans Helping Veterans Now out of Longmont, and I reached out to them and got on the bus from Boulder and made it out to Longmont and just went to one of their open house acupuncture things, and she did the acupuncture on my ears, and I remember feeling like someone was caring for me, like out of the uniform and as a woman, and it was the most special feeling, like, wow, I might be worth this somehow. And so I started seeing her more, and then got involved. I got sober and got involved in a recovery community, and so that was really the gateway, that program. So that was so important to me. I just was on the board as they shut down a couple weeks ago. It is really sad, because that was the only thing that seemed, it was like a lifesaver for me at the time.
Any desires to get something going, like whether an informal group thing or anything in the works?
I fantasize about that all the time. There's a cool organization called Phoenix Multisport, and it's a sober, active community, and I would love to start something with CU veterans, aside from that, that gets them active, like under the guise of sports maybe, but also involved in community leadership, like meeting with people out in town, working with mentors. And there's another program called Salute Colorado. Yes, and he's a Marine Corps helicopter pilot and a successful real estate brokerage, and he's started this side business for mentors. I'm an associate there. So we meet monthly and we hear from speakers, entrepreneurs out in town. It's geared towards veteran entrepreneurs. And they bring in all sorts of big names for us, and we're paired with a mentor, and they encourage us to do speaking engagements out in town. So that's a fantastic model. And yes, certainly. And this.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, the CU veterans, They do a great job. There's kind of just some satellite things and lots of things sort of happening. It's hard to, yes, I think about that all the time.
And it just, it strikes me too, because how sometimes simple it is for such a complicated subject. And, you know, one of the things that we use in our first responder meetings back in California is, you know, it just takes two people and coffee, and then eventually you get more in, and it's not a bitch session, it's just people, whether you're military veterans or not, coming in and just talking about anything, you know, and that eventually grows and grows and grows, and so you have this informal group, and it's a support group is what it turns into. And it's the dynamic is really, really interesting, but it's I guess what basically in a long way, I'm learning from Ed, making a short story long, but it's like don't think of it as a fantasy, because it's something that can happen.
Yep.
And it's just a very easy thing to. So.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are you familiar with the hyperbaric chamber, oxygen hyperbaric chamber in Louisville?
No.
They offer, I don't know, I mentioned it when I got up and spoke, but the hyperbaric chamber is an oxygen under pressure. It's not covered by the VA, but it's proven to be very effective in treating traumatic brain injuries caused by explosions and also post-traumatic stress syndrome. We usually have at least one, up to 4 veterans going through the Louisville Center every week. They come from all over the country, discharged with problems or VA hospitals that basically throw medication at them rather than treatment. And it's proven to be very effective. But like I said, it's unfortunately not covered by the VA. But the foundation up there does not charge anybody for it. And they come from all over. And we go up, the Legion goes up and gives them dinner once a week at their house. They have a house that they can stay at for free, right 2 blocks from the center. And that is a possible outlet. I don't know if you're interested in looking at that. I know they've done a couple, especially videographies of what they do up there, and they try to get that out to the news media. I don't know if you're interested, but I can give you the name of Eddie. He runs the center up there.
And what does it kind of do?
The oxygen treatment.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you're familiar with a hyperbaric chamber. Anybody, usually pilots know about it, and divers. And it's a chamber that you go into. It's pressure. I'm not sure how many atmospheres, but provides pressure in an oxygen-rich environment. And if you talk to the doctors up there, they say that it helps, especially with brain injuries, to reconnect those damaged interconnections, neuro centers. I'm not a doctor, so I can't talk about it. But I know but it's they've got a Marine, I think he's a gunny sergeant, former gunny sergeant. And he's the counselor up there. And then they also have a doctor that's assigned. And they've done a couple of videos of it. But I know Eddie's always looking for ways to get the
story out.
Where is it located? It's in Louisville, right on Old Boulders, South Old Boulders. Yeah. Old Boulders. South Old. I'm sorry, South Old. It's called the Rocky Mountain. I think we call it HBOT, which is hyperbaric, kind of a short term. But I'll get it for you. It's the Rocky Mountain Hyperbaric Association or something like that. But anyway, I know they're always looking for ways to get
cool
out and video of what they do up there and to get out to the news media.
Very cool.
And I have a question for you on what's it like to be a veteran going to work through a school and see you?
That was. Now I think I'm in my 3rd year and I'm very adjusted. I love the kids. But the first year I moved on the hill And so I was living right in the thick of all the partying and had just gotten sober. And I remember one experience where a girl I had a tough time adjusting and going back. And first I tried to fit in with the kids, and that didn't go very well because I'm a lot older and I have a lot different experience. And then there was one gal who was just broke down on campus, like in tears and something over her iPhone. And I remember being very angry, like, who the fuck cares about your iPhone, you know? But then I got to appreciate the kids and realize, like, this is what we're fighting for, is for people to have this great college experience, and I'm just so grateful to have it now. Oh my goodness. Like, CU campus is beautiful, and every time I walk across it, I'm just like, wow. I felt like Mary Tyler Moore the first time on campus. I was like, I'm here! It was the neatest thing. And so, man, the GI Bill is just such a gift.
You know, I can speak to that because I was called on a cadet at CU for 3 years. And my first year, I started in June, and then we had September 11th. Mm-hmm. And so we were very aware of what was going on, very focused on what was going on around the cadets, because we didn't know how the campus was going to react. And we were out doing drill one day, and this kid, he kept walking back and forth, and he was watching the kids drilling, and I thought, all right, this guy's making me nervous. And finally he came up to me, and he said, thank you for this, because you allow me my feeling. And he walked off, and I just thought, whoa, that wasn't what I was expecting. I'm waiting for him to pull out a gun or something, you know, and he was just watching him. So, in the CU cadets, I don't know, I thought it was a great relationship, and we never had, we were like all from the regular student audience.
Yeah, it was really good to find that shift of perspective, because it was easy to look at everyone and be angry and bring that out in everyone. And it was so much better to be grateful and see that. So
the attitude on campus is appreciation for veterans, not like it was after we came back?
No, I would say not necessarily appreciation, but, well, yes, appreciation. They're certainly not regarded negatively. That's never been my experience. But it has been my experience that it's just very foreign, and I relate to that. When I grew up, there was like 2 ROTC in my high school, and I just looked at them funny and stayed away from them. And that's
Why was it?
Because I didn't know anything about it, and all I knew was maybe a movie at that point, and it's like, why would anyone want to do that?
See, I find that interesting. I came from a military family, but I find that interesting because the lieutenant colonel that spoke at the Veterans Day talked about meeting. He said when you sometimes meet civilians, they look down and kind of not
avoid.
You know, almost avoid. But he says it's not. He was making the point that it was not out of disrespect, but out of humbleness, and you know.
Well, I think part of it though too, back in our day, you knew you had uncles, you had brothers, you had quite a grandparents who had all served in the military. So you had an exposure to it. I mean, now we're a much smaller military. You have a lot fewer people who ever knew anyone who served.
That's true.
You know, and it becomes a lot more iffy. And my question for you is, still, even though we say there's a lot of respect and there's a lot better, still you constantly read in the news of soldiers, men and women, coming back with PTSD. You know, constant deployments, never-ending kind of war, and problems just integrating back into society. And how can you, in your own experience coming back, you know, can you really recommend to a young woman coming out of high school and stuff that the military is something they ought to consider?
I could honestly say that I had an excellent experience that I could never have imagined. And so that's what I do like to tell people, is to just be open to possibilities. But that was a great point, and that I think that a lot of civilians I'll get that kind of response like, oh, you're a veteran, what's over there? And it's not, and it's sometimes out of humility, and they just don't know how to talk about it, or don't know what it means, or it's weird and just unfamiliar, and so I get a lot of avoidance instead of approaching that. But then a lot of people are very, I mean, it was really neat to speak at the high school last week, and they come up and shake your hand, and they were hanging on every word. So there is a ton of awareness coming about. And so I just try to not fall into any of the stereotypes, like blowing up on anyone or demanding respect, or just try to be and I also have veteran plates on my car, so I try to drive very respectfully. Like, if this is only going to be the only time that they see a veteran, I don't want them to be cutting them off, or, you know.
Are there other veterans that you are in contact with that see you?
To be honest, my experience has been interesting. When I do see a veteran, it's awesome, but I often don't know that they're veterans. And there was one kid I had in my class when I was very new, and I was still, my attitude maybe wasn't the best, and we went out to a party on the hill, and I left early because I was not really digging it. And I went back a couple hours later, walked by the house on the way, and he was really drunk on the porch and telling war stories, and I mean, I was much older, and a female, so I can talk about things maybe easier. And I really feel for these young kids going on just a tour to Iraq, whatever, come back, try to fit in, and don't know how, you know, they're different, but they don't want to be. And so that's just a side story. To answer your question, I am in contact with some veterans. And especially from my career field, we have a pretty tight-knit network online, and it's nice to stay connected with everyone there.
I have another question. You know, nowadays it's a little bit different in the last 10 years than it was in my day. The military was large. The active duty was large. We had a military that was to fight 2 wars, basically, if we needed to. Now it's a smaller military, and as a result, the reservists and the Guard, National Guard, get deployed regularly. So they go out, and they go for a 6-month or year tour in Iraq, Afghanistan, and they come back, and then they have to go back to the civilian world, and then they could go back. Have you experienced, has that caused more problems? Because, you know, when you come back and you're a military, and everybody's military, you know, you just come back and go back into training. Or
on base with a lot of...
Yeah. But coming back into the civilian world, and then going possibly back.
I cannot even imagine that, because the only experience I have with that is the side of the active duty in-country who hated it when reserve units would come, because they're not long-term trained, and they're like civilians who are given a gun, we would call them, or I would hear it being said, and so they would show up, and it was often like a cluster trying to get them acclimated, and they were maybe...
That's always been the way.
Yeah, okay. and then sometimes, yeah, and then they were gone, and it was like, well, thanks, you shitheads. And so they were not really accepted by their active duty brethren or, you know, the civilian community. So I can imagine that would be so challenging, because they would often get sent into the hottest situations because they're like expendable almost. And that was a underlying attitude. And so they would see this crazy stuff and come back, and I can't even imagine what that would be like for them. So that's a great perspective that I hadn't considered.
And Jenn, it's interesting, I've got a step-grandfather he spent 9 months in Afghanistan, and but she never got off base. She was only administrative in the Air Force. And she said the longest was 10 years, you know, 9 months. But your experience of being out with the population, I don't think she knew anything better in Afghanistan, Nolan, right? So.
And that's tough too, because in Camp Leatherneck where we were always hearing about a lot of those bases. They got attacked plenty, And so even being in the wire and in a supposedly safe zone, you're still like on edge, because we would hear about things getting launched over the gates or IEDs showing up from people who had snuck in. And so these attacks were still happening. It was still like, you still feel it, you're still there. And then also to be in an active zone and not be actively, I mean, you're certainly playing an important role, but I can imagine that would be very challenging too. And I certainly think some people say, oh, if you deployed and didn't leave the wire, then it wasn't a deployment or something. And I completely disagree, because even just being there, it was certainly a sacrifice. So, yes.
Two things. Speaking of PTSD, how do you feel about yourself in that kind of interaction? And also, as a female journalist, with respect, how did you fight off all the hordes of these macho men?
That was actually the second question.
Yeah, well, maybe that caused it.
I had a great experience as a female. I know a lot of women who had sexual trauma experiences, and I had nothing but awesome experiences with my military brothers. And I feel really grateful for that. I think that I just like put off a tough girl vibe, and maybe I'm taller than most, and so, you know, I could kick their ass if I needed to, and left me alone.
See, I think it comes from confidence.
Yeah.
Self-confidence.
I agree. And wouldn't speak too much more to that. And then with PTSD, when I came back from deployment and had a ton of money, and I was changing duty stations shortly after, so I was just temporary, and so I got a house on the beach in California to kind of treat myself, and my parents came out and brought me a car to use for a short time, and so life should have been perfect again, but I hadn't processed anything. And I remember sitting there on the beach in California, and I was so angry. And it got really bad. There was people walking by, like kind of overweight Americans, and I was upset that they had the ability to do that when these other people in Afghanistan were just born out of a different circumstance and screwed because of that. And so I knew myself well enough to say, like, hey, I felt violent towards people, and so I told my command that, and they sent me to a 30-day PTSD rehab, and that was great. So that gave me a lot of tools to deal with, and so now here, fast forward to a couple years later, and I can kind of tell when that's happening a little bit, because I'll start feeling resentful if people around me are having fun, and I start having thoughts like, why are you having fun? Don't you know there's a war? Like, Jen, you don't get to have fun right now. There are people dying. And so these thoughts start to creep in, and a therapist, veteran friend of mine, really helped me to get some perspective on that. He said, a lot of veterans might think that they're having PTSD if they're not processing through those thoughts as they arise, or acknowledging them, or have the tools to do that. And that's because it's normal for that stuff to come up. And so if I process it as it comes, then I don't think it gets to the necessarily like disorder phase. And so I work on that, but I'm in a relationship recently, and being that close to someone who can show me my behavior, I can see that I can see things that come up easier from time to time. So I feel really grateful I had a good experience with the VA and got some tools to recognize that, which is often not the experience. Yeah.
Let me make a comment. Jen mentioned our visit to Centaurus High School a couple of weeks ago, which was really cool because we had 3 veterans, Mike Klein, World War II, Lyle Borders, Vietnam, and Jenn, Afghanistan. And I'm really big on generations in military and just in general life. And what was really cool, we had 500 students in the auditorium that day. And the kids were just great. They asked really good, intelligent questions. And both Jenn and Lyle Borders, our Vietnam vet, and Mike as well, really connected with the kids. And the great part about that visit and we did the same thing last year. But the great part about the visit this year was that the connection with the kids was really good because of the commentary that went back and forth, not only with the speakers and the kids, but one of the teachers in introducing the veteran speakers did a really good job of prepping the kids. I actually went through 3 cycles of student classrooms in the morning. And each time this one teacher kind of went over the meaning of Veterans Day kind of historically, and then kind of brought everybody up to date. And then also made the kids understand that the current war in the Gulf, going back to the first Iraq War and current, is the longest war that we've had currently in our history in terms of duration, and kind of put everything in perspective for the kids. And then Jenn did a really good job of giving the kids the perspective of age, the relevance of the age of the kids that were in the audience. We're talking high school now, 14 to 16 years old, and where she was in high school. And these life decisions that she was making at that time, putting all that in perspective. And then she did answer that question that one of the kids asked about her decision making at her age. And would she recommend going into the military after high school and stuff like that? Answered the question just great. And then Lyle, as a Vietnam veteran, reminded the kids that of the number of helicopter pilots, which he was in Vietnam, there were 61 pilots in his kind of overall unit that were killed at age 19, not too many years older than the kids sitting in the audience. So this was really great that these veterans were able to make all those connections and all those relevant points to these kids that's sitting in the audience. And it was really cool to see that reaction, to see those kids kind of soaking all this in. And I thought that visit was really, really cool for us to be able to do that this year. And I really thank Jenn and Mike and Lila for being able to do that.
That was fantastic.
Did you guys find through that experience that it kind of renewed a little bit of faith in the future?
Oh, I think so. And I thank my friend Lisa Lowe, one of the social studies teachers there, for allowing us to be able to do that in this last couple of years. And we're going to continue doing that. And I think those kids, and by the way, one of the things that they do, and what we were able to see while we were there, is they do this Wall of Honor every Veterans Day, where they honor their own family members that served in the military. So there's already that connection and that ability to understand at a certain level of what military veterans are about, because they already do that celebration themselves. And so to that extent, to answer your question, I think there is some hope. Yeah. So I think it's cool.
Thanks for doing that.
It was so neat because, especially, I mean, if I had something like that in high school, I would have a completely different perspective. And the kids can also, on the Wall of Honor, they could pick a random person, and so that they didn't have to know them. And so there was a lot of anonymous people who had been selected. So kids are actively going out on their own and researching a veteran. It was really special. Yeah. So thank you for putting that together.
Just a slight different comment. There's a book over there leaning against the wall you may take a look at. It's called The Journey Home. It's a thank you to America's veterans. And I was recently involved in an honor flight. And in preparation for that, a young family came to the meeting. And the mother, who's an artist, said one day her daughter, who was pretty small, asked her, "What is a veteran?" And it forced her to kind of stop and think and try and tell the story of what is a veteran. And she put it, in words and in artist things, and it just was a very nice book.
This is beautiful.
You know, what I find interesting is the speakers that come and talk about Afghanistan and some about Vietnam that actually get out and mingle with the people. It's amazing how you always hear about the kids, the families, what genuine people they are, because I think, you know, I was never in a combat zone, but I lived with Italian families in their apartments, I lived with British families, German families, and I think that's so great when Americans can draw from the culture, because, you know, if you're not a well-traveled American, you don't understand how other people live. And I found myself, you know, later on in my military career going, why do people hate Americans? I mean, they hate us. Why is it? And one day it just was like I was watching something on TV, and it was a political kind of thing, and I thought, they hate us because we're arrogant. And that was the first time I
ignorant.
thought that way about Americans. I thought, you know, they can perceive us as being very arrogant. If you don't live with them and know them, and they get to know you as an American and what an American is really like, they have this. Because I know when I was in England, the top television shows were Dynasty, Dallas, Hill Street Blues, and Miami Vice. And I thought,
what an accurate picture.
you know,
Just real quick, from my own family experience, living with Italians is a combat zone.
That's true. You know, and the perspective you get, because, you know, when I lived with my Italians, my apartment was on the 5th floor, and it was for the Americans. That's what, it was rented to Americans, and it was rented to GIs. My apartment was bigger. Well, it was me living in my apartment, and the Italians that were on the first 4 floors, my apartment was twice as big as theirs, if not 3 times bigger than theirs, and there were 5 of them living in that place.
Wow.
Wow.
My patio was larger than their living space.
I really,
What a different.
yeah.
And my apartment was for the Americans. So I mean, I got so much perspective out of that assignment, just seeing how they lived, and they would have shared anything with me. I can't tell you how many meals I had with those Italian families, and how many, you know, I was taken in like I was one of them, but...
Did they speak English, or were you?
Very, you know, a lot of sign language. They had us, their daughter was
I lived in Sicily.
a senior in high school, and she was which helped a lot.
Yeah, I really relate to that experience. That's maybe one of the biggest takeaways from the military, is getting that outside experience. And I'll just kind of close here, and then I want to show one more video. Or is that okay for time? Okay. So I think I still learn more every day about what I learned from the military, and that outside perspective, especially when I see my friends who haven't. Some people who travel abroad or live abroad get that, and not necessarily from the military side, but I feel really grateful to have gotten that worldly experience, not having the money to go and live abroad. So that's really neat.
Because at one time my perspective was it should be mandatory for at least 1 year's military service in overseas, not necessarily in a combat zone, so kids can learn how entitled they are to live.
Seriously, I can't agree more.
Or
And-
Peace Corps, or any, you know, anything like that.
Mm-hmm. And when I first got out, I realized, or I didn't want anything to do with it, and I really separated myself, and then slowly I've learned the value of those characters. Like when I had a camera in my hand, I could go talk to anyone, and I could kind of like persuade anyone to take part in my bigger picture and spreading this message, and that was an incredibly valuable skill. And so it's been really neat to re-adopt the skills that I had in uniform and make them my own as a civilian. And that's been really special and continues to do that. And, okay, this is an experience, this is a fun story. So when we were bored on base, I still needed to put out stories, even though there's like nothing's happening. So we'd find news, and this was a really fun example of that. And this actually aired all over Asia. I was really surprised.
His arrival in Cambodia in 2002, Sergeant Dan Dingley Jigs takes it upon himself to ensure his Marines are on their best behavior.
Jigs sometimes go after the formation. He leads the formation sometimes, but sometimes he falls back and tries to blast everyone's boots, kind of correcting them, alignment to the right.
Sergeant Jigs can be so strict at times that his fellow Sergeant Robert Fallon jokes Jigs can hold down the fort on his own.
Oh yeah, he will keep the shop in good condition. Make sure all the Marines are working all times. We know that we have to, we can leave at any time.
One time our 7th went off fooling around, all of a sudden he just runs out, barking at us, thinks he's going back to work. He's always watching. He's always popping up on you, small guy. Can hide under vehicles easily. When he's up close to you, that's when you know you gotta take him serious and you better stand up for parade rest or he'll have it.
But Sergeant Jake says he's just doing his job as a sergeant.
I'll make sure he gets outside. Picked up the rank of corporal, had an accident in the commanding officer's office one day, and was busted back to Lance Corps. Since then, he's served his time honorably and was recently promoted, I believe, on November 1st to the rank of sergeant.
Sergeant Jake shows his softer side with kids from Camp Fuji's adopted orphanage.
Just by his presence, gives the Marines around here a sense of being home, having a pet, someone to be around, a man's best friend.
Just the way he carries himself around the shop, it's like everybody respects him, and he just gives you that lifting spirit that you need every day.
As long as someone knows that they're going to see Jigs in the morning, they're going to be happy, and he tries to keep a lot of people out of trouble.
But for Sergeant Jigs, it's just another day. Marine Corporal Jenn Calaway, Combined Arms Training Center, Camp Fuji, Japan.
We did this for fun and it went everywhere. It was so cool. So that's a good example of AFN, like giving people some hometown comfort when they can be in these really foreign situations. So Nino, does anyone have any more questions? This was so fun to hang out with you.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you so much.
So just one thing real quick. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it, especially on this nice brisk day here in Colorado. I want to present Jen with a challenge coming from the museum for her great talk today. And thank you very much, Jen.
Thank you for this. This means so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Please stick around. We have refreshments, and I think we still have the books that John's there, if you'd like to get one.
If anybody would like to